This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavyon Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood in the heart of my hometown of Beit Shemesh. That puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Aliya Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, and this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbinic couple. I can't emphasize enough how impressed I am that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be making aliyah and leading the spiritual development of this project in order to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. As you likely know, the Krohns are a wonderful and beloved rabbinic family. As a Beit Shemesh resident myself, I'm excited to watch how much their being part of the Eden Project will make this development unique and religiously impactful. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast.
What is our covenantal standing with God? Is God mad at us? Are we in right relationship with God? And Jews outside the land of Israel say, of course, we're in right relationship with God. Look at the permissiveness of the Persian Empire. They are allowing us to practice our ancestral laws. We have freedom of mobility. And not only that, but look at these scriptural texts that we can study and interpret, our Torah. And we don't have to go back to Jerusalem because now we have this portable set of scriptures that God has given us, signifying God's happiness with our transition into being a more global population. Jews in the land of Israel, especially those affiliated with the temple in Jerusalem, say, no, the exile is not over. God is not happy with all of us, and it's your fault.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. William Faulkner in Requiem for a Nun famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." I repeatedly thought of that line as I read Dr. Malka Simkovich's recent book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity. In that book, she investigates the relationship of Jews living in the land of Israel and Jews who remained in the diaspora after the conclusion of the Babylonian Exile, when the majority of Jews chose to remain outside of Judea rather than return back to their ancestral homeland. Although this took place well over 2,000 years ago, in some ways I felt as though I were reading contemporary accounts of the relationship between Jews in Israel and Jews in chutz la'aretz. It reminded me of a recent interaction I had with a student of mine in response to the Orthodox Conundrum episode from 2 weeks ago entitled, "Do You Care Enough About Israel, and Do Israelis Care Enough About You?" Let me read what I wrote to him and part of his brief response. I wrote, "I absolutely agree that Israel is the center of the Jewish world and needs to be. That's simply a part of Torah Judaism, and some people don't understand that living in Israel is a value. So my belief is that not everyone should make aliyah. There are very good reasons not to do so. If someone does not because of family considerations, or because of financial considerations, or even because I don't like Israel, all of these are valid. No one should move somewhere if he or she will be unhappy. And anyone who says that that person should make aliyah regardless is being condescending and unfair. The problem arises, in my opinion, when someone doesn't move to Israel because it never even occurred to him or her to do so. In other words, if someone doesn't move to Israel because Israel and aliyah aren't values, that is just seen as one more Jewish community like LA or New York or Lakewood, then there's a serious hashkafic problem afoot. That's how I see it. There are many good reasons not to make aliyah, and far be it from me or anyone else to discount those reasons, which are intensely personal. However, there is no good reason for a Torah Jew to believe that aliyah is essentially the same thing as moving to Brooklyn. That demonstrates a real black hole in that person's hashkafat olam, worldview, in my opinion. Thus, I do not want to make aliyah. All good with me. My Jewish life is every bit as rich if I live in New York as if I live in Israel. I have a problem with that. although it may be as rich or richer in other aspects, of course. But in terms of location, it is by definition inferior to living in the land promised by God to the Jewish people. My student did not appreciate that last line, and he wrote back, "I don't love the description of it being inferior, to be honest. I think that kind of language would also turn people off of aliya." To that I responded, "I'm not using it as an aliya pitch. I'm speaking on a halachic and hashkafic level. Can you argue that living in the diaspora is just as good from a Torah perspective as living in Israel? I don't know anyone who could argue that based on Torah sources. I'm not talking about the quality of the person or even the quality of their religious life or their connection to God and Torah. I'm speaking purely in terms of location. I don't see how anyone can argue that living outside of Israel is just as good religiously as living in Israel. Again, I'm not being judgmental. I'm talking about the narrow question of, is it better to live in Israel or not according to Torah sources? I don't think you'll find many sources that say otherwise." Now, after talking to Malka Simkovich, I realized that this conversation with my student echoes similar tensions from the time of the Second Temple. Strong differences of opinion and misunderstandings are, unfortunately, not a new phenomenon. They have been going on for literally thousands of years. That's why I was extremely interested to learn about how Jewish communities outside the land of Israel first came to be, how they defined themselves, whether they valued aliyah, and if they frequently visited Judea, how Jews living in the land of Israel viewed Jews outside and vice versa, whether Jews living in the diaspora saw Jews living in Israel as their religious superiors, what happened to those communities in the long run, and much more as well. The echoes of the present, it seems to me, are uncanny. The history here is fascinating, and the parallels to today are extremely important. They're both comforting and disturbing. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Malka Simkovich is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. Her first book, The Making of Jewish Universalism from Exile to Alexandria, was published in 2016, and her second book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, The Scriptures and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, was published with JPS in 2018 and received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her third book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, was published in June 2024. She is also the author of over 100 articles, including pieces that have been published in journals such as the Harvard Theological Review, the Journal for the Study of Judaism, the Jewish Review of Books, Tablet, and the Christian Century, a Leon Charney Fellow at the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, a Sachs Scholar for the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs Foundation, and a Kogod Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Malka served as the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union from 2014 to 2024, and she speaks regularly to audiences across North America and beyond on topics related to the Hebrew Bible, Jewish history, and contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. Dr. Malka Simkovich, thank you for joining me again on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you and great to see you.
After having given that introduction about my interaction with my student, I'd like to start off talking about the original, I suppose, dispute. And in so doing, I'd like to talk about some of the difference in the Hebrew terms we often use. There is the Hebrew word galut, there's the word gola, and then there's the Greek derivative diaspora. Could you describe a little bit the difference between these different terms?
Yes, absolutely. And it's so important to get these terms just right, because I do think that there is a misconception that is very common today, which is that Gola or Galut is a very negative term that suggests that Jews who live outside the land of Israel are extensions of the Babylonian exile that took place in the 6th century BCE, and the diaspora is this preferable, more neutral term, which simply designates all Jews who live outside of the land of Israel. In fact, if you take a look at how these terms are used in the ancient world, the opposite is the case. The Tanakh generally does not use the term galut. It uses the term gola. And it's very important to distinguish between what the gola is as it appears in the Tanakh and what the galut is as it appears in centuries of rabbinic literature. And of course, it doesn't always mean exactly the same thing, but we can say a few generalizations with broad strokes. And then in between, in the Second Temple era, when there was this vibrant Jewish population outside the land of Israel that is speaking primarily Greek, we have a new word that's invented, diaspora. These three terms are different from one another. They have different theological valences. And so I'll start with gola. Gola in the Tanakh is a designation for the particular experience of the expulsion of the Judean population, which took place between 597 and 586 BCE. Scott, I hope it's okay to use those secular years, but
I will allow it.
Okay. So this expulsion, according to Sefer Melachim and Yirmiyahu and other texts, is an experience that all of Yehuda undergoes. Now, scholars, archaeologists in particular, might say, well, that's not the case. We have evidence that throughout the 6th century BCE, there were Judeans who were living in the region. Perhaps not all the Jews were expelled. Judeans. It's actually important to not say Jews. We could talk about that controversy. Are they Jews? Are they Judeans? Are they Judahites? I like to say Yehudim because what trips us up there is the English language and not the reality on the ground. So the notion that all Yehudim were expelled from Yehuda might be an overstatement. But in any case, according to the Tanakh, Yehuda loses its population. They are forced into Bavel. And that Gola ends when Persia conquers Babylon, which we know is in 539, at the end of the year, 539 BCE. And Cyrus Koresh announces that these Yehudim who have been in Babel can go back to their ancestral homeland and rebuild the temple. So the Gola is a limited experience. I would say conservatively, it really kicks off in 597 BCE, but it comes to its completion. The process of exile comes to its completion in 586 BCE, and then it ends in around 538 BCE.
I actually did a search in the concordance before our conversation. I noticed that the term Gola is not used, as far as I could tell, regarding the Assyrian Galut, the Assyrian exile. It's only used at the earliest, at the very end of Sefer Melachim Bet, in the 24th chapter. It has 25 chapters altogether. At the very, very end, it's barely used in any of the historical prophetic works. It's used more in Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel and some later books like Ezra and Nehemiah. And it seems to refer specifically, as you're saying, to Galut Bavel only.
Exactly. It is not a word that does heavy lifting theologically at this early stage. So very often my friends, especially in Israel, will say, oh, I never refer to Jews as members of the Gola or the Galut because that would be so offensive. No, not really. If you read the Tanakh, it isn't doing that theological heavy lifting. It is interesting, however, that the Gola clearly comes to an end and it applies to all Yehudim. So in that way, it's actually a very limited term. It's a term that is quite contracted. Now, later prophets and leaders who are teaching and kind of disseminating older prophetic traditions after the Gola ends, they might say, well, the Gola didn't fully end because not everybody returned. But according to the late First Temple prophets, the Gola is always meant to end. There are two ways in which it will end. The temple will be rebuilt and everybody will come back. Now, the controversy, of course, is, well, what do you do now in a reality when not everybody has come back? But the idea of Galut Bavel, or we should say Gola Bavel, is that it is contained, it begins, it ends, and it applies to Yehudim. In that way, it is totally different from the diaspora, which was invented to split the people in half and is ongoing, doesn't have an end. Totally different. Now, Scott, I can say a little bit about Galut, or we could just stop there and...
Well, does Galut have a different implication from Gola or diaspora, or is it one of those two ideas?
I think it's a different idea. And I think it's also really sloppy to say, well, the rabbinic understanding of this particular word is X. You're talking about centuries of rabbinic literature. Some of it comes from Bavel. Some of it comes from this, quote, diasporic context. and other traditions come from the land of Israel. And anyone who's done a little bit of research into the rabbinic approach to the Jewish experience outside the land of Israel will know that there's right away, it's obvious that there are contradictory approaches and attitudes and tensions and disagreements. So first of all, there is no monolithic rabbinic attitude towards the value of living outside the land. The question of, whether it's inferior to live outside the land or not, it just cannot be answered by making a list of every rabbinic reference to galut and then saying, all right, we're going to mush them all together in a soup and then decide what the soup tastes like. That said, we find new ideas in rabbinic texts that do not appear in the Second Temple era. And two of those ideas are very powerful. One is that, unlike diaspora, galut is not a place. Galut is an experience, and there are temporal aspects to that experience, and there are spatial aspects to that experience. Right now, we Jews, we live in galut, right? You live in galut, Scott. I live in galut. Maybe I'm in double galut because I'm in the time of galut and I'm also in Skokie, Illinois. Maybe you're just in single galut. I never thought of it that way, actually, until I'm saying it right now. But we're both in galut.
Because of its temporal aspect.
Exactly. And so in thinking about galut as an experience, as an era, we Jews, you and me and all other Jews, are brought together in anticipation or supposed anticipation of the end of that era. By the way, I'm very stressed out about the tradition that when I go to Shamayim, I will be asked, did I anticipate the redemption? We can talk about that another time.
Okay.
But the temporal aspect of galut softens the boundaries surrounding the land of Israel and brings all Jews together into this common experience of galut. Now, that might imply that we are somehow estranged from God because we're all in this state of estrangement, of separation, however you want to define galut. This absence of something, absence of a temple, absence of a utopian, idyllic society that we can build, except we can't right now. But the other idea that the rabbis maybe invent, actually, is that God is in galut with us. You don't see any reference to that idea in the Second Temple era. It's a fascinating, I think, brilliant idea that brings God into communication and into this kind of intense relationship with us by virtue of our common estrangement. So now what are we estranged from? We, the Jewish people, and God. Well, we're estranged from this temple society that is both spatial and temporal that we cannot build right now. And so that is a very nuanced understanding of galut that doesn't map well on to the Golah of the Tanakh, and it certainly does not map onto the diaspora. So all my friends who are so worried about not saying galut or Golah, and they talk about the diaspora, it is not a neutral term, so you can just tell me that I'm in galut and I'll be fine with that. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll make sure to do that. What's interesting, I saw myself, is that the Targum, the Aramaic translation for Golah, does call it the galut, galuta. And I think almost every place that I saw it there. So clearly there is some overlap of those ideas in the rabbinic understanding, at least as the Targum puts it. But that's somewhere in the middle, I suppose, when it comes temporally and understanding what that means.
Well, certainly the Golah of the Tanakh and the galut of the rabbis are closer connected to one another than whatever Jews conceived of as the diaspora. And in a way, the rabbis are returning to certain ancient biblical conceptions. And in particular, when you look at the prophetic traditions about God yearning for the people, just beautiful prophecies about God's despair and anguish in the experience of that physical separation as the people leave the land. You could certainly take those prophetic traditions out of their 6th century BCE context and say, actually, God is talking about right now. And the Midrash does it all the time. I mean, yes, we could be snobs, we could be academic, readers of the text and say, no, you can only read it in this 6th century BCE context. But certainly the Midrashic writers were not doing that. They were saying, look at how God is in a state of anguish. He's in a state of anguish right now because we are in galut. So they're reading their Tanakh very, very carefully. Nothing here is sloppy. And they're returning to some of those texts. Again, both in the sense that there is a temporal aspect to the biblical Golah, as there is in rabbinic literature, and in terms of what does this mean for the covenantal relationship, and are we estranged from God?
Okay, Malka, I have a very technical question. Your wonderful book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, deals with diaspora in general, but specifically with Egypt during the Second Temple period. And I apologize for my ignorance. How did they get there? How did they end up from the Babylonian Golah in Egypt? Like, what happened exactly?
It's a great question. And it's a question that scholars have argued over, but we have some really interesting hints. Now, the high level answer, the general answer, is that there are waves of migration from Yehuda to Egypt beginning before the first temple falls. So even in the late 7th century BCE, we are finding hints, both in the Tanakh and elsewhere, that people who are living in Yehuda go to Egypt. In some cases, they flee to Egypt. And again, in waves of migration, allusions to this can be found in Yirmiyahu, who famously is weighing whether he should go to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, or to Bavel. According to some traditions, he ends up in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. And that's the beginning of a number of waves. And in the late 6th century BCE, we begin to have more concrete evidence of what these migration patterns looked like. When Persia conquers Babylon, they establish garrisons throughout their empire. And as they confront Egypt, they're establishing military garrisons in Egypt. And one of those garrisons is comprised actually of people from Judean ancestry. And so that community of Judean Persian military officials ends up on an island called Elephantine in the Nile River. And we actually have the writings of that community that settled there for at least a century. And we have the papyri that was found in the beginning of the 20th century that leaders of this community wrote. So again, it doesn't happen at once. It happens in waves beginning the late 7th century BCE, maybe again in the early 6th century BC, and then again in the late 6th century BC with the Persians, and so on and so forth. And we know in the 2nd century BCE, when the world is Hellenized, the Persians are long gone, the world, at least this region of it, is divided into 3 major Hellenist kingdoms. We've got the Syrian Greeks to the north of the land of Israel. We've got the Antiochids to the east, and we have the Ptolemies to the southwest. We know that at this time, there was a very overwhelming migration and a very important migration of Yehudim to Egypt in the 2nd century BCE. So it's happening all the time. Now, what's a really interesting question is, are we seeing the reverse pattern? Are we seeing waves of migration from Egypt back to Judea throughout the Second Temple era? And what's our evidence for that? Are waves of Judeans coming back to the land? What's shocking, I think, is that we actually don't have that evidence.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
You'd think that there would be, and we know from the Tanakh that a lot of people did not come back. You'd think, though, there'd be some movement over time. Certainly people living in Israel in 2025 see the inevitable movement of everyone who lives outside of Israel eventually back to Israel at some point, meaning on a religious level. And I'm curious how people in Egypt saw things back then, whether moving to Israel was a religious goal at all, or it was something saved for the ultimate future, or something else entirely.
Anything is possible, and I'm not going to make an argument from silence and say nobody moved back to the land of Israel. We just don't have significant evidence for that. Now, I want to nuance that statement by saying we do think that many tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Jews were traveling to Jerusalem on the pilgrimage holidays to pay for sacrifices to be offered on their behalf and to come into community with other Jews and pray in their ancestral homeland, but then they went back home. We also know that they supported the temple and its administration monetarily, that they're sending huge amounts of money. We know this because Roman officials complain about it in the 1st century BCE. And again, it shows up in the middle of the 1st century in numerous sources. Josephus talks about the huge sums of money that are being sent not just from Egypt, but from all over the Roman world, wherever Jews live, money is flowing to Jerusalem.
Why do the Romans care? Why do they complain about that?
They're furious about it. And actually, I've said this on a number of podcasts. So, Scott, I apologize if I said this in one of our past conversations, but one of the most interesting pieces of evidence that we have for the massive quantities of gold and silver that Jews are sending comes from the Roman orator Cicero, who I think in 59 BCE gives a speech in the Roman Senate, which advocates for the passing of a bill to ban the Jewish export of gold from Egypt to Jerusalem. And he is presenting this as an act of treason, essentially, because those are funds that should be going to Rome. And so when the Jews of Judea spectacularly lose the war against Rome in 73 CE, the first thing that Rome does is they say every single Jew in the empire, not just Jews in Judea, but every Jew, doesn't matter your level of affiliation, doesn't matter how you dress or look or what language you speak, you need to pay us the fiscus judaicus, and that money is going to go to support the temple of Jupiter. And actually, Louis Feldman, I think, has an incredible article on how those funds supported the Colosseum, the building of the Colosseum. Now, does Rome really need Jewish money? Probably not, but there's a propaganda campaign at work, which is to say those treasonous Jews, even your neighbors, even the Jews who live down the block, who go to the market with you, you see them in the agora, you see them in the public spaces, those Jews are responsible, and this is where we get to be a little contemporary, a little resonant, Scott. Those Jews are responsible for the catastrophe, the expensive catastrophe that took place in Judea that distracted us for 7 years, from 66 to 73 CE. And it distracted us, and it cost us a lot of manpower and a lot of money. Your Jewish neighbors are also responsible for that. They are sending their funds to support this war, AIPAC. But these Jews are supporting the war, and they're supporting the wrong side. And so we're going to essentially force their hand and make them send money to the right cause. And the right cause, of course, is the Roman Empire.
Is that the reason that they were so angry, so to speak, at the temple itself? I always assumed it was simply the center of the revolution. This is their God. We're going to destroy their temple because that's a symbol of their revolutionary spirit. But it was actually more than that, a financial issue, that we get rid of their temple, we can take their money?
I think it's part of it. I think that they also are perplexed about what's going on in this temple of the unseen God, this temple that will not include a statue of the Roman emperor. Caligula, we know, is very upset in the late 30s CE that the Jews of Jerusalem will not erect a statue of him in the space of the Temple Mount. We know this from the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who writes about it in one of his treatises. And after Augustus, so beginning in the early first century, Roman emperors are not arguing that they're gods after their deaths. They're arguing that they're gods in life. And so if these Roman emperors are not worshipped as deities while living, and if the Jews are not going to acknowledge that with statues in their own temple, then they are rebellious and they are treasonous. They're working against the interests of the empire. Now, the Jews respond and they say, wait a second, we're bringing a daily sacrifice on behalf of the welfare of the Roman emperor and his family. We are praying every day as well for the welfare. In fact, we Orthodox Jews do that every Shabbat, praying for the welfare of our own government. Comes Caligula and later emperors and say, that's a joke. You know, it's very cute that you're bringing a sacrifice to your God on our behalf. But in doing so, you are in fact denying our own divinity. And so we consider that supposed homage to actually be an insult. And so it's meaningless to us. Now, the first act of supposed rebellion in 66 CE, Josephus tells us, is the cessation of that daily sacrifice to the emperor. Josephus says that when Rome got wind of that, they didn't like the daily sacrifice probably, but then when they get wind of the fact that it stopped, now they know the Jews mean business. And now they start to get a little nervous.
That is really fascinating. I want to get back to our main conversation about diaspora Jewry now. Let's go back to what happened after the Babylonian exile, and then people returned to Israel, but most did not. When I say Israel, I'm referring obviously to what was then called Judea. I'll use the colloquial term Israel or the land of Israel as well, though. When, however, did the idea of two or more distinct communities take root? In other words, people at one point were living primarily in Judea, living in Israel, the land of Israel. Then they were primarily exiled. And then many, but not all, came back. Most did not come back. When did people start seeing this as we are actually two distinct communities or multiple distinct communities?
It's a great question. The word diaspora, which means scattered seeds, of course, does not appear until the late 3rd century BCE. It's a Greek word. It's invented probably by the translators of the Septuagint, which is the official Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah. There are many translations of the Torah that are circulating in Greek at this time, but this ends up being considered the most authoritative, perhaps even divinely approved version. This word diaspora conveys an idea that the world, the physical world as we know it, is split in half between Jews who live in the land of Israel and then everybody else who embodies a kind of divine rejection that extends from the 6th century BCE. Now, the question is, does the concept of diaspora exist before this word is invented? And one of the things that I argue in my book is yes, it absolutely does exist in the Persian era, in the Second Temple period. It takes time to get going. It takes time to spread. But by the time the Judean translators of the Hebrew Torah are working to translate that work into Greek in the late 3rd century BCE, the concept is well developed. And that concept is a Judean concept. I think that it takes root a few decades into the Second Temple era when Yehudim who return to the land look around and they say, wait a second, the majority of our kin aren't coming with us. Where have they gone? And can we get them to come back? The reality on the ground, and we know this from the 2nd chapter of Ezra and elsewhere in the Tanakh, is that probably only around 43,000 Yehudim return in those early years to the land of Israel. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of Yehudim who either stay in what is now Persia or they move westward, but they don't go to Yehud. That's the name of the province. It's Yehuda, of course, but the Persians call it Yehud. They don't go back to Yehud. They maybe settle in Egypt or elsewhere along the Mediterranean coast. Now we have a huge theological question, and that question is exile over? The prophets guaranteed that two things would happen to mark the end of the exile. The temple would be rebuilt and everybody would come back. If you're dealing with a reality in which most people have not come back, the stakes are extraordinarily high. It's not a question simply of, is the exile over? It's a question of, what is our covenantal standing with God? Is God mad at us? Are we in right relationship with God? And Jews outside the land of Israel say, of course, we're in right relationship with God. Look at the permissiveness of the Persian Empire. They are allowing us to practice our ancestral laws. We have freedom of mobility. And not only that, but look at these scriptural texts that we can study and interpret, our Torah. And we don't have to go back to Jerusalem because now we have this portable set of scriptures that God has given us, signifying God's happiness with our transition into being a more global population. Jews in the land of Israel, especially those affiliated with the temple in Jerusalem, say, no, the exile is not over. God is not happy with all of us, and it's your fault. And so what is once presented in the biblical text as a divine punishment now transitions into becoming a sin, right? What was once a reflection of divine anger that was going to come to an end, well, it doesn't come to an end. So now you can't blame God. You got to blame the people who are experiencing this punishment and, in fact, frame it as a sin. They're perpetuating their own estrangement from God.
So how did those Jews, committed Jews in the diaspora, explain to themselves the fact that only one of the two symbols of the end of exile take place. They acknowledged the temple was there. You already explained that they were very into the temple. They didn't reject the temple, yet they didn't come back. Why did they not see it, as the Judeans did, as a responsibility and as a sin not to do so?
This is a really difficult question. And I think it explains, actually, your question is an answer to the question of why is there an explosion of interpretive activity in the Second Temple era of the scriptures. We find, especially in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, a massive volume of interpretation. And many of these interpretations consider the physical place of the Jewish people and their standing with God. What emerges is a dissonance between how Jews in Judea and outside of Judea, I try not to say diaspora, but what emerges is a dissonance between how these populations understand the modality of the Torah versus the content of the Torah. Jews outside the land of Israel are saying, look at this modality. We have this portable set of scriptures. We're gathering together weekly or maybe even more to read and interpret these scriptures. And we're going to produce interpretations that celebrate specifically the universal omniscience of the God of Israel and the fact that God of Israel really wants us to take on a responsibility to bring knowledge of God to the nations. That's the interpretive focus of these Jews, especially in Egypt. Jews in the land of Israel say, the modality, that's very nice, but you're overthinking it. We're interested in the content. And the pshat here, if you read Devarim and you read many other parts of the Tanakh, the pshat is stop working so hard, first of all, interpretively. Stop working so hard. The plain sense of the text is telling us that we are called to build a society in the land of Israel. That is basic. Stop working so hard to make it into something else. But the Jews, especially in Egypt, are highlighting the universality of the God of Israel to say, well, that was then, that was very nice. And this is now. God wants us to spread out, and God wants us to bring these teachings to all of humankind.
Wow. With that in mind, did Jews outside of Israel have any conception that moving to Israel would be, and again, I apologize for using the term Israel, I'm using the modern term, moving back to the promised land is a desirable thing? In other words, you already said that aliya wasn't, at least as far as we can tell, such a big thing. People really weren't moving in that direction. If anything, they're moving the other direction. Did they see that as a positive when people did it, as something that was desired, or something that would wait for the ultimate future?
To be honest, I know of almost no texts from the Second Temple era that even address this question. It's almost like, they're just inured to it. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. We don't have evidence of a mass wave of migration from Egypt or elsewhere outside the land of Israel to the land. We do have texts that come from the, quote, diaspora that celebrate the centrality of Jerusalem and its temple, that express admiration for it. I think that these texts are not representative of the mainstream, but a really good example of such a text is a book known as Two Maccabees. Two Maccabees was originally written by a Jew named Jason of Cyrene. Cyrene, or Cyrenaica, is in modern-day Libya. And this community, which is a community really that thrived throughout the Hellenistic era and even in the centuries following, this was a community that, similar to Alexandria, had access to the highest levels of what we might call academic learning in the Hellenistic world. They had access to studying philosophical texts, and they also many of them read their scriptures in Greek. Jason of Cyrene writes a 5-volume account of the Hasmonean rebellion that takes place between 175 and 164 BCE. He writes his account. Someone condensed it. We don't know the name of this person. We just call him the condenser. And that condensed version is what we have that is known today as Two Maccabees. We do not have Jason of Cyrene's original 5-volume work. But as it comes down to us, Two Maccabees is oddly fixated, I think oddly because I think it's unusual, fixated on the welfare of Jews who live in proximity to the temple, But I also think that the author is more interested in the temple than on the people who protect it. It's a very temple-centered text. It could have nothing to do with what we might call Zionism. It could have to do with the fact that by the time he wrote his work, he wasn't impressed with the Hasmonean family, they were becoming increasingly assimilated. And so to take attention off of their complicated legacy, the author of 2 Maccabees focuses on Jerusalem and the temple. Again, I don't know that that's hard evidence for an attitude, or certainly not a mainstream attitude, that Jews outside the land of Israel are presenting aliya as an ideal, but it's a very, very temple-centered text. It could be that I'll think of an example, Scott, but if I did, it would be very hard to find one. We don't find it in Philo. We don't find it in Josephus. We don't find it in the Elephantine documents. We don't find it in really any of the Greek texts that were produced in Alexandria by observant Jews. On the other hand, we know that Jews throughout this era are living in Eastern regions, what will become Sasanian Persia, and we don't have their texts. We have rabbinic literature that comes later, but we have a huge vacuum of literature from really the entire Second Temple era. Jews were living in what was Babylonia and now is Persia. We don't have their texts.
So you're saying that it could be we just don't know. There's a huge vacuum in terms of what we know. We only know certain communities, how they felt, but it may be spurious to extend that to the entire exiled community.
Correct.
Interesting. Correct. Now, you just mentioned how Jason of Cyrene had access to the highest levels of what we'd call academic learning. I'm curious in terms of the sense of superiority that people either in Judea or outside of Judea felt towards the other. In other words, right now, we already know, as you said, that people living in Judea had a sense of, I don't know if the right term is condescension, but it's your fault that the exile continues to whatever degree it is because you should come back. Does that mean that they also felt religiously superior in their understanding of Torah? Does it mean that the people in the exile felt that they understood the Torah better than the people in Judea?
It's a fantastic question. I think that there is a lot of evidence to back up the notion that Jewish leaders in Jerusalem felt, maybe condescension is not the right word, but certainly they felt very strongly about the extension of their own authority as wending its way throughout the whole world. They positioned themselves as religious authorities. They argued for Judean exceptionalism. And when they wrote correspondences, and that's really what my letter is about, is these correspondences, when they wrote letters to Jews in Alexandria, they played up their religious authority and they associate the origins of this authority with their proximity to Jerusalem and the temple. We don't see it going in both directions. We do see defensiveness on the part of Jews in Egypt and elsewhere. They're arguing for a dual loyalty. They're arguing for the legitimacy of their communities outside the land of Israel. They feel very devoted to the welfare of Judea and its inhabitants, but they also want to present themselves to their host empire as loyal and as good citizens. One of the most interesting documents that we have, which speaks to your question, Scott, is a letter that is appended, it's added to the book of 2 Maccabees. It was a letter written in the second half of the 2nd century BCE. There are actually 2 letters appended to 2 Maccabees written by Jews in Jerusalem to Jews in Alexandria. And in one of these letters, which is the first letter appended to the book, we are told, or the Jews of Egypt are told, that we Jews of Jerusalem are praying for you, and we hope that God will forgive you. We hope that God will open your heart to his law and his commandments. And law in Greek is nomos, but nomos is the word for Torah. They're probably saying, we only have the Greek, but probably it was originally written in Aramaic or maybe Hebrew. And they're essentially saying, may God open your heart to his Torah and mitzvot. This opening prayer is actually, I think, a hostile critique. Maybe not hostile, but it's a complex relationship. And they're pulling these Jews of Egypt towards them by saying, we want a relationship with you. We're going to write this personal letter to you. the point of that letter is that they want the Jews of Egypt to observe Hanukkah, which doesn't yet have a name, but they want the Jews of Egypt to observe on an annual basis a commemorative holiday that affirms that what happened to the Jews in 164 BCE was a reflection of God's particular care for the Temple Mount and those who protect it. And so that's the point of the letter. And they're pulling these Jews of Egypt towards them by saying, we care about you, we care about your religious welfare, we want to be connected with you, we want to share these holidays, but we're also keeping you at arm's length because we're presenting ourselves as the authority, and all the practices that you take on have to go through our authoritative channels. And so they're pulling them towards the Judean community with one hand and pushing them away with the other.
And to what degree did the exilic communities accept that authority? Did they accept it at all, or did they completely reject it and laugh at it?
We don't know. We do know that they express their connection to Judea and the temple, which is not exactly the same as accepting the authority of individual leaders in Jerusalem. As I said, the Jews of Egypt are sending huge amounts of money to support the temple. After the successful Hasmonean rebellion in Judea, we also see a rise of Hebrew names that are being given to Jewish children in Egypt, whereas in the early 2nd century BCE, Jews in Egypt were giving their children mostly Greek names. 3 generations in, they're giving their children Hebrew names, which is fascinating.
It almost sounds like 1967 and the way people, I was not alive then, but the way the people around the world felt this surge of Jewish pride.
Exactly. Yes, definitely. It happens again after 70 CE. We see another shift in how Jews in Egypt are naming their children. Does that mean that they are regularly sending she'elot? Are they sending, halachic questions to leaders in Jerusalem for them to rule on? We don't see evidence of that, but it's interesting because when there were conflicts within the Roman Empire itself, and before that within the Greek Empire itself, especially in the late 2nd century BC, where there were civil conflicts taking place in Egypt, the Jews had to be very careful about what side to choose. And sometimes when they chose a side, they were accused, this is really resonant, of only choosing that side because that particular supporter had friendlier relations with Judea. This is true. And I talk about that a little bit.
I can't imagine any modern parallel to that whatsoever.
Oh, no, nothing. You can never make historical analogies. That would be irresponsible.
Of course. I'd like to ask you a question, and I apologize if this sounds simplistic or reductionist. In my mind, I'm sure many others as well, I always thought of Hanukkah as having 2 aspects, and we often say that the military victory reflected primarily in Al Hanisim, versus the menorah in the temple, which is much more what we see in Masechet Shabbat, for example, reflected a bit of tension between, or a lot of tension, between the Hasmonean dynasty and the rabbinic elite. And they really were at odds with each other. But Malka, based on what you've said now, it sounds like that's actually parallel to maybe even primarily, not such an argument between rabbis and kings, but between diaspora Jews and Israel Jews. Is that true?
I think it absolutely is true. And I'm going to say something that I've never said in public. I'm a little nervous about saying it, but many years ago, I wrote an article for the Torah.com on the history of Hanukkah and the literary evidence that we have for how Jews practice the holiday in the ancient world. And in that article, which I probably wrote 10 years ago or maybe even more, I argued that the sources for Hanukkah from the Second Temple era focus on the military aspect. By the time you get to the rabbinic era, the rabbis who are wary of what can happen with insurgencies and were wary, especially the legacy of the Hashmonaim as being dangerously militant for their own times, the rabbis shied away from that and they celebrate instead the theological aspect of the story. I no longer stand by that position. So if the editors of the Torah.com are listening, maybe they'll allow me to reissue a clarification.
You heard it here, folks.
After years of researching for this book, I'm very confident in saying that the theological aspects of this holiday that becomes Hanukkah are always there, particularly in Judean retellings of the story. As soon as Judeans are writing letters to their Egyptian kin and saying, this is an important thing that happened to us, and we believe that it says something about our relationship with God, and also is something that you should care about, because it's not just about God's care for the Jews of Judea, but it says something about our broad covenantal relationship. All of that is happening 2 generations into the Hasmonean era. And these letters, also, the second one in particular, references a miracle that was done with fire, which is similar but not identical to the miracle of the oil tradition that we find in rabbinic sources. So the theological aspect is there from the beginning, because Judean leaders understand if they're going to focus only exclusively on the military aspect of what happened between 175 and 164 BCE, they will not effectively be able to convince their Egyptian kin to commemorate this event every year. It won't be enough. The Jews in Alexandria will say, we're so happy that you won this war. Congratulations, shkayach, we support you. We are absolutely not going to commemorate this once a year, because unlike every other holiday, this did not happen to all Jews. So of course it makes sense to observe the pilgrimage holidays, even in diaspora or even abroad. Of course it makes sense to celebrate, Yom Kippur. I can't say so much about Rosh Hashanah and at this early stage, but the point is that it happened to everybody. We share that history. But then you get to the 2nd century BCE, and this military victory takes place in Judea, and Jews in Egypt are saying, it didn't happen to the majority of Jews. Why would we institute a holiday? And then Judean Jews come back and say, but you don't understand. If you properly interpreted our victory, you would appreciate the fact that this is a culmination of a series of miracles that God did at the Temple Mount to convey God's protection of the Temple Mount, but that protection says something about our entire covenantal relationship. This should matter to you. And so that theological argument is there from the beginning. So the Torah.com editors, I am sorry, but I don't share that article anymore on social media. I think it's the only one where I really feel a little self-conscious about, actually. Yeah.
I want to ask you, though, and I'm using terms that they probably wouldn't have understood, but if I can apply a modern understanding, to what degree would we say, and I feel a little bit funny saying this, that the Jews in Judea and the Jews outside of the land of Israel represented almost 2 different religions? Were they a single religion, a single community, or they lived in different places? Did their belief systems diverge enough that we would say they wouldn't use the same terms to describe what they thought? Like, for example, that universalism of God that the Jews in Egypt believed, and you said the emphasis in Judea was much more on the covenant at the spot of the Temple Mount and the need to come into the land of Israel. Does that mean that they really were 2 separate communities? I mean, religious communities.
I feel very strongly that we're talking about one population. And I think that it's easy to get tripped up, especially because in English, when we say Judeans, in some cases, scholars are talking about all Yehudim everywhere. And in some cases, they're talking about just the people in the region known as Judea. And then that kind of sets up a false binary. Are Judeans from Judea? So then what are people elsewhere? It's confusing. But I do think that certainly by the 2nd century BCE, what becomes Judaism, what is becoming Judaism, is in effect throughout the world. That Judaism, or what 2 Maccabees calls Judaismos, is no longer simply an ethnogeographic identity that affiliates that particular population with a set of practices. I think, and I've said this so many times, we problematically overstate the influence and the power of sectarian communities at this time. Wherever you lived in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, certainly, if you did certain practices, you identified yourself as a Jew. The core identifying markers of Jewish practice by this time are circumcision of the baby boys, dietary laws, however that they were practiced might have differed from community to community, but there were commonalities, such as refraining from pork, separating probably meat and milk, having particular dishes for different things. The Qumran community, by the way, takes it to the extreme. But it's dietary laws, it's circumcision, and it's Shabbat and holidays, so a separate calendar. Jews were keeping these core practices wherever they lived. We know this because not only from Jewish sources, but because Greeks and Romans who are living beyond the world of Judea are complaining about these practices as separatist, as reflective of the Jews' misanthropy. What's interesting is that what's not on that list is purity laws. We don't know the extent to which Jews outside the land of Israel are thinking about purity laws, are observing purity laws, are immersing in the mikvah. It is very important to numerous communities in the land of Israel, but I would not list purity laws as one of the core identifying markers of Jewish practice in the ancient world. I think it's Shabbat, circumcision, dietary law, and it's also the regular gathering together to read and interpret the scriptures. So these are the common practices. And I think that the latter practice of coming together to read the Torah and interpret it brings these Jews into community with one another psychologically because they're telling the same stories, they're sharing in the same history, they're conceiving of themselves as connected to Jews who they'll never meet, just in the same way that right now we feel connected to observant Jews, or no, sorry, take that back, to all Jews throughout the world based on the shared history. But it's the observances that I think are bringing these Jews into psychological community with one another. So yes, we could talk about sectarian populations, which were tiny. We could talk about those particular extreme practices that are unique to those sectarian groups. But I think that what brought Jews together and in community was much more powerful than the more esoteric, abstract debates concerning the standing that Jews outside the land of Israel had covenantally, theologically, with their God. Those are, I think, similar to plenty of debates that we have today. At the same time, we're not arguing, as far as I know, over who is a Jew and how is that determined based on where they land on the spectrum of this debate. So again, what brought these Jews together was much more powerful than what separated them. And when we're talking about texts, we're talking about polemics that don't often reflect their reality, but are pushing against it by making very extreme statements.
Okay, I want to ask you about what you mentioned a moment ago in terms of the communal getting together to read sacred texts, what I assume is the roots of the synagogue. So did the synagogue begin in the non-Judean communities, and those in Judea had the temple, and was it considered a replacement for the temple temporarily? I know you said that temple mattered to them, but at the same time, practically speaking, it wasn't so close. Or was synagogue worship something that took place in Judea as well at this time?
Oh, absolutely. There were synagogues in Judea in the Second Temple era. No question about that. And that's why, partly why, when the temple falls in 70 CE, the Jews are actually not in an existential catastrophe. They might be in a state of profound spiritual anguish and in a state of uncertainty in terms of their future, but existentially, they can survive as a people because they have a system already in place. And at the heart of that system is the synagogue. They're already gathering regularly to read from the scriptures. By the way, one way that we know this is from the New Testament, because Jesus is going into these synagogues to read and to not to simply read, but to share homiletical interpretations of the scriptures, which is something that they did. And at the same time, this was certainly happening in communities outside the land of Israel as well. We have references to the synagogues, sadly, the synagogues that were destroyed in anti-Jewish, what we would maybe call a pogrom in 38 CE in Alexandria. Philo describes the synagogues that were destroyed. We know from later rabbinic literature that there was this grand, majestic, famous synagogue in Alexandria, but in fact, there were probably dozens of synagogues in Alexandria. And essentially, all we mean by synagogues are places where Jews are gathering to read and interpret their scriptures. It doesn't have to be, and probably wasn't, a standalone structure in most cases, although we don't know for sure.
When you talk about the lack of existential crisis that took place after 70 or 73 CE, I assume that stands in stark contrast to the existential crisis that did exist when the Babylonians exiled the Jews.
Maybe I overstated it. The rabbis have their work cut out for them in 70 CE. Their program, I think, is to institute a practicable set of observances that any Jew can keep wherever they live in the absence of a temple. So certainly they have to produce a normative system of practices and liturgy. And that's a huge project. I would never minimize the importance of that project or minimize what's at stake. But they're able to do that because they're not inventing new things. Again, we have to nuance all of this. The rabbis present themselves as inheritors. We know very famously from the beginning of Avot that the rabbis, basically are saying, look, it just fell in front of us, this transmission that goes all the way back to early biblical times, seamlessly and continuously. We're just inheritors. Now, of course, there are plenty of things that the rabbis are innovating. In many ways, we might even call them revolutionaries, but they have a system that they are working with. They are not inventing something called the synagogue. They are not even inventing something called liturgy, but they are creating normative practices, and that takes centuries.
Malka, what ultimately happened to these communities outside of Israel? You already said that they really were one big community, a macro community with the communities in the land of Israel. At the same time, after the destruction in 70 CE, people went all over the place. Different things happened. Would you say or not say that the communities outside of Judea were more likely to assimilate or become proto-Christians or something like that? Or is there no distinction whatsoever that the people who are what we'd call Jewish today are equally descendants of the Jews from Judea and the Jews from places like Egypt and the Persian Empire?
We lose track mostly of the Jews of Egypt after the 2nd century. And there are different theories about what happened to these Jews.
2nd century CE.
CE. Did they assimilate into Roman life? Did they convert to Christianity? Did they simply leave because the region was hostile? We do know that the region was hostile to Jews in the 1st and early 2nd century. So what happened to these Jews? Again, did they leave? Were they wiped out? Did they convert? A lot of these questions remain up in the air. I think in the next 20 years, we're going to see a lot more scholarship on non-rabbinic Judaism of the first 4 or 5 centuries. This is part of what's tricky, but also very exciting when we talk about this period. We're kind of switching to a new camera scene. When we're talking about Second Temple literature, the camera lens is on primarily Judea and Egypt. Yes, you could talk about some Jews that lived in Antioch in modern day Syria, and certainly they were prolific, but the majority of our literature comes from Judea and Egypt. And yeah, we could add Cyrene in there too. When you get to the 2nd or 3rd century, the camera on Egypt turns off. And now we have the camera on Sasanian Persia, which had been off and now it's on. Does this mean that everyone just disappears? No, it's just the confusing nature of trying to explore systematically what Jewish life was like 2,500 years ago, when what has come down to us is sparse and also inconsistent. The same, by the way, goes for archaeological excavations, which have been over the past 60 or 70 years in Israel, extremely illuminating when it comes to the rabbinic era. Does that mean that Jewish life wasn't equally flourishing in places where we can't dig? No, of course not. But we can't go to Iraq, as far as I know, right now. Tragically, we can't go to Aleppo. Very tragically, we can't go to and I don't think in our lifetime, I hope I'm wrong, I don't think in our lifetime we're going to be able to go back to these places and dig. But if we did, maybe we would even find caches of papyri, of documents, of codices. We just don't know what we don't know.
Okay, again, displaying my ignorance, one question about Judea. I know there's also a district the Romans called Galilee. When you speak of Judea, is there a fundamental difference between Judea and Galilee in terms of, was Galilee seen as a diasporic community, or was Galilee seen as less than part of the land of Israel? How was that seen by everybody? It's
a great question. I am not the expert on this question. It is one of the questions you've asked that are, it's illuminated by the New Testament as well, where you do see a much clearer distinction between Judea and Galilee as separate regions, with separate reputations And someone from the Galilee might be considered to be a little bit more of an outsider to the world of the temple. And the fact that Jesus is kind of walking around, hanging out with people from the Galilee rather than Jerusalem, speaks, at least in the eyes of these authors, as reflective of his interest in getting to know the real Jews, not necessarily the powerful, fancy
The
ones.
Amcha.
Yeah, exactly, the Amcha. So yes, I mean, these were two different Roman regions, but when it comes to how Judaism was practiced, I would keep the boundaries soft. There are all kinds of interesting rabbinic traditions about how the rabbis moved north in the late first century. We don't know to the extent to which these traditions are literal, where there are already people practicing in the Second Temple era in a way that would have looked similar to later rabbinic practices. I'm almost certain the answer to that is yes. So practice-wise, I would soften the boundaries, but from a Roman perspective, yes, these are two different regions.
Okay, Malka, to conclude, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit and to talk about some of the parallels between what existed 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago and what's going on today between Jews who live in the state of Israel. Now I can speak about that modern term versus living in non-Israeli communities, because I just find it so fascinating. Everything that you're saying now and things that I read in your book, the parallels are uncanny. The fact that things don't really change, at least on some level, that, again, maybe you wouldn't like this term, but the potential condescension of Jews in Judea towards Jews outside of it. I've been accused of that myself. And I understand. I'm curious if you can talk about maybe some lessons that you've learned from this study about the way that these communities relate to each other and the way we should relate to each other.
It's very generous that you're asking me this question as if I'm some kind of expert on contemporary Jewish relations and, diaspora-Israeli relations. So I appreciate this platform, even though I don't deserve it. I will just say I'm deeply Zionist. Anybody who follows my social media handle, not that I recommend it, especially on Twitter, knows how deeply connected I feel on a personal level to Israel, to its right to exist, to defend itself from its existential enemies, to flourish, to be the home for the Jewish people. At the same time, I feel very strongly that we have to figure out a way, especially we in the modern Orthodox community, the Dati Leumi community, we have to figure out a way to cultivate a Zionist ideology that does not depend or is in no way scaffolded on Shalilat HaGolah. I think it's toxic, especially for modern
Meaning the
Orthodox.
negation of diaspora.
Yes, thank you. I think it's toxic for modern Orthodox Jews in North America to be imbuing their children with values that are somehow dependent on this notion that to support Israel, we have to talk about ourselves as if we don't have legitimacy. I hear Jews sometimes saying there is no future for the Jewish people outside the land of Israel, as if it's self-evident. And this kind of self-negation is essentially, I think, teaching the next generation that if they want to be authentic Jews, they cannot fulfill their authentic Jewish selves outside the land of Israel. When it comes to discourses about authenticity, I feel very strongly that authenticity can happen anywhere. And if you're going to make a historical argument and say, well, no, true authentic Jewish practice derives from the land of Israel, the historical evidence does not back that up. The normative practices that were established by the rabbis were established in the land of Israel and in Babel. And before that, Jews throughout the Hellenistic world were establishing practices of Judaism without worry that they were somehow, at least I'm saying from the quote diasporan perspective, they were buying into this notion of common Judaism, of common Jewish practice, without any thought or concern for their own authenticity. I don't think that we should be self-negating our legitimacy. And I say I'm talking about Jews outside the land of Israel. We should not be doing that. We have to figure out a way to cultivate our confident, unyielding, enthusiastic support for Israel and its right to exist as the homeland for the Jewish people without saying we want to put an end to diaspora. Now, I have seen a sea change, I think, anecdotally from my friends in Israel. Maybe this is October 7th, maybe it's something else, but over the past couple years, I have seen friends in Israel convey a more balanced approach when it comes to their self-understanding and their understanding of Israel-diaspora relations. I think part of that tragically comes from questions about Israel's future. Are we as secure as we thought we were? Are we going to be around? And are we going to be a safe haven for all Jewish people in 20 years, in 50 years? That level of uncertainty, that level of fear, to be honest, is, I think, creating a more tempered perception of Jewish life and what it can do outside the land of Israel. So I would say the questions that we as Jews need to ask ourselves, whether we're modern Orthodox Jews or just Jews outside the land of Israel or Jews in Israel, is how do we cultivate a strong Jewish identity that is based on a love and a connection for Israel, while not demanding a self-negation on the part of Jews who don't live there.
Okay, that's really interesting, Malka. I'll just conclude by saying one very quick story that happened to me about a month and a half ago. I was at my sister's in White Plains and had a talk with maybe 20, 30, 40 members of the community there. And at one point, somebody said to me something like, should there be a diaspora Jewry? Should Jews exist outside of Israel? Because I've always been very vocal that I don't believe everyone needs to make aliyah. I'm not someone who says, if you don't make aliyah, you're not a real Jew. I do not say that. And my initial answer was, of course, we certainly need Jews outside of Israel, because if there were no Jews outside of Israel, then the governments outside of Israel wouldn't necessarily support Israel. We need you there in order to convince your local governments in the diaspora communities to be more supportive of the state of Israel. And of course, I was rightly called out in my saying that as you're really just negating the entire concept of a diaspora Jewry as an adjunct to Israel and has no independent validity. Just wanted to mention that as a trap, which I've fallen into, and I'm sure many of us fall into quite frequently.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. We're all just doing our best, muddling along over here.
Anyway, I really appreciate talking with you. It's always very, very interesting and fascinating, and this was no exception. Dr. Malka Simkovich, I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavion Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood in the heart of my hometown of Beit Shemesh. That puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Aliya Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, and this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbinic couple. I can't emphasize enough how impressed I am that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be making aliyah and leading the spiritual development of this project in order to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. As you likely know, the Krohns are a wonderful and beloved rabbinic family. As a Beit Shemesh resident myself, I'm excited to watch how much their being part of the Eden Project will make this development unique and religiously impactful. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info at edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.